member's bill, putting it into perspective. And I thought it was done well when Dr. Comack indicated that since 1892, Section 43 of the Criminal Code really allows parents to hit and hurt their children as a form of a punishment. I want to stop and pause there because I do think that norms and mores of society change through time. I was born in '62, and I can recall in my earlier years, in and around that mid '70s, early '70s, where there was a great deal of issues surrounding, well, my mom, my grandparents, this is the way in which we were raised, and so forth. And I was surprised to the degree in corporal punishment was actually being used in homes. I know from experience that it was something that was actually tolerated quite freely in society, especially all the way, I would suggest to you, into the early '60s, where we started to see some changes in a significant way. Now, maybe different regions of the country might have reacted. Some might have been a little slower, some might have been a little faster than others. But the bottom line is, Madam Speaker, I believe that what has happened over time is that people have recognized what was acceptable back in the '60s and earlier would never be tolerated today. When I'm out in the community and you see someone hit a child, which someone is a guardian, whether it's a parent or whatever it might be, that causes a very different reaction today than it did a couple of generations ago, and the commentaries that go along with it. I was a member of the Manitoba legislature for a number of years, and I can remember a vivid presentation that was made to us, and it was on the issue of corporal punishment. And the presentation demonstrated that for some people, they believe that they really do have the right to hit and hurt a child as punishment. And some of the visuals that were shown it's just absolutely cruel. For example, the whipping of a child with a vacuum cleaner plug-in, Madam Speaker, or the cord of a vacuum cleaner, where it actually left warts, or the physical abuse to the degree in which the child ends up going into a hospital. And we're not talking about, just 13, 14, the teenage years. This goes all the way from the examples I saw, went all the way till almost infancy, that 2, 3-year-olds as a form of punishment. That, to me, is abhorrent. And that was, during the late '80s, early '90s. And we knew that it was happening. And there were some people that were actually defending, not necessarily that extreme level, but ultimately arguing that corporal punishment is, in fact, very effective as a form of ensuring discipline amongst children. And that's why I say, it pleases me today when I reflect through time how it is that Canadians as a whole, I believe, have changed in terms of those norms and mores, believing as that 700 plus organizations, a vast many of them are educational type of organizations, no doubt sharing their thoughts, their experiences with the public, let alone the many others that no doubt are out there that share those concerns, but maybe might not have been aware of the legislation coming forward. The thought is, Madam Speaker, that we know better today than we ever have. And it's surprising when you think of it to the date of 1892. That is something that really quite surprised me when I first found that out in terms of the criminal code. I see that I'm about to run out of time. I did want to focus a bit of attention on the calls for action, because there is a call to action, number 6, and I've had opportunity to talk about a number of calls for action as the government, in many different ways, has completed some. Most are under progress, Madam Speaker, and this is one of those pieces of legislation that will have and deal with the call for action. I believe it's number 6, Madam Speaker. Could be wrong on that, but I believe it's number 6. I do know it's a call for action. And at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, I think that through that inquiry, again, there was a great deal of research that's done. So once more, we're moving even more towards the issue of reconciliation. That is something that's also important to recognize, Madam Speaker. I like to think that there has been a great deal of cooperation in recognizing that we have members of Parliament on different sides of the House that recognize the true value of the legislation and ultimately would like to see the legislation pass. I am one of those members of Parliament, and I do thank the member for taking the effort and bringing it forward. And as I say, I think it was even a part of that agreement that we have, but I think it's something in which we have to continue to support because it's something that's really necessary. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove.
Good. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Assault is against the law in Canada, and assault gets a very broad definition in the criminal code. Section 265, a person commits an assault when, without the consent of another person, he or she applies force intentionally to that other person directly or indirectly. Now, note that the definition doesn't talk about how forceful the force must be, but only that is intentional without the other party's consent. So for an example, a slap on the wrist could be an assault if it was intentionally applied without the other person's consent. So today we're talking about teachers and parents and the children who are under their care. The adult in the room could be charged with an assault for a slap on the wrist applied to a misbehaving child under their care if it were not for the Section 43 defense, which reads, every school teacher, parent, or person standing in the place of a parent is justified in using force by way of correction toward a pupil or child who is under their care if the force does not exceed what is reasonable in the circumstances. So teachers and parents have a defense. And it's, if the force was reasonable and intended for correction. Note that it does not defend punishment, and it certainly does not allow corporal punishment like some of the other speakers have been suggesting. That is just not the case. The private member's bill before us today would repeal Section 43 and eliminate the defense altogether. Now, it's based on the, as I said, the mistaken belief that corporal punishment is legal in Canada on account of the Section 43 defense. It is not. The proponent, in his testimony before the Standing Committee, and today again, noted that his bill is at least in part in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Report, call to action number 6. That is absolutely true. And he quotes, again quoted today, Honorable Murray Sinclair, who gave testimony earlier in the Senate, and he cited examples of residential school teachers punching children in the face and causing serious injury. So that's a battle that the member for New Westminster Burnaby is fighting today, and he thinks that repealing Section 43 is going to solve that problem, is going to win that battle. He is wrong. There's been a recent Supreme Court of Canada decision 20 years ago called the Canadian Foundation of Children, Youth and the Law versus the Attorney General of Canada. The case started its journey through the court system at the Ontario Trial Court and made its way ultimately to the Supreme Court of Canada. It was brought by a group of organizations that had the best interest of children in mind. The petitioners argued that Section 43 infringes on the constitutionally protected rights of children to life, liberty, and security, Section 7 of the Charter, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, Section 12 of the Charter, and the right to equal protection and benefit of the law, Section 15. The trial judge found that Section 43 does not infringe any of these constitutional rights. The Ontario Court of Appeal agreed. It came to the Supreme Court of Canada, where Chief Justice McLaughlin wrote for the majority. And I just want to read one quote from that decision, which goes to the very heart of the issue. She said, "The Section 43 defense provides parents and teachers with the ability to carry out the reasonable education of the child without threat of sanction by criminal law. Without Section 43, Canada's broad assault law would criminalize force, falling far short of what we think of as corporal punishment. The decision not to criminalize such conduct is not grounded in devaluation of the child, but in the concern that to do so risks ruining lives and breaking up families, a burden that in large part would be borne by children." So, appeal dismissed, but the court didn't just leave it there. It took the time to give guidance to teachers and parents and law enforcement agencies as to what Section 43 means. They made it clear that Section 43 protects only reasonable force applied for corrective purposes. And then they went on to state, some detail, what reasonable in the circumstances means in Canada today. Now, based on what our reading of the Supreme Court decision, the Conservative members of the Justice Committee put forward an amendment to this private member's bill, which basically codifies this Supreme Court of Canada decision. As an aside, probably something that should have been done 20 years ago by whoever the government was at that time. I think it was the Liberal government, but the subsequent Conservative government could have picked it up. This government certainly could have picked that up to codify that Supreme Court of Canada decision that would have gone a long way to clarifying the law. Unfortunately, that did not happen. At committee, we heard from many experts, and I just want to underline this, Madam Speaker, that the experts that I'm going to quote are critical of this private member's bill, but they were all in support of the spirit and intent of the call to action number 6 of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. But they were saying that to repeal Section 43 is too risky for teachers and students. 4 witnesses that I just want to quote or highlight. Dr. Lisa Kelly, law professor, explained that Section 43 is far narrower today than it was when it was first drafted in 1892 and the way it was applied historically during the residential school days. She cited the Supreme Court of Canada's decision that I just highlighted, which in her words read in a series of limitations as to what would constitute reasonable correction. Ms. Heidi Yetman of the Canadian Teachers Federation, this is at the April 15th meeting, stated the Federation cannot support this legislation unamended. The risk of unintended consequences that could make the classroom unsafe is too great. Ms. Tessa Fiddler, Indigenous educator, also with the Canadian Teachers Federation, said, in an ideal world, there would be more support for students in difficult situations, and educators would get the support that we need. The sad reality is that that kind of support is not there. So passing Bill C-273 without amendment will make an already challenging job more challenging. And I've just say again that the Conservative members of the committee tried to put in those amendments. They were turned down by the other members of the committee. Mr. Sébastien Joly of the Quebec Provincial Association of Teachers said this: the removal of elements of protection included in Section 43 in the absence of an amendment to the Criminal Code to guarantee protection for school staff would constitute a serious risk for teachers. So there we go. I would just summarize the testimony by saying that we had some very, very credible witnesses at the committee saying that repealing Section 43 is risky business if there is not something else to fill in the gaps. Now, I'm going to suggest too that the Liberal members on our committee actually agreed with that, because at the April 29th meeting, after having had the opportunity to reflect on this very compelling evidence from very expert witnesses, credible witnesses, told us at committee that they had gone, had a discussion with the current Minister of Justice and Attorney General, who has apparently assuring us that there will be new legislation coming to fill in that gap. They realize that the evidence that we've received from these teachers and professionals need to be taken seriously, and so they realize that there is a risk that there's going to be a gap that needs to be filled. And so they're promising that there will be legislation coming at some time in the future. I believe what they're saying is that we should just vote for the bill now, repeal Section 43, recognizing that there is going to be a serious gap that many people are going to be deeply concerned about. But at some time in the future, they're going to fix that. And the Conservative members of the committee are saying, let's fix it right now. The legislation is before us, the draft legislation. We are deeply into it. We understand what the issues are. Let's fix it right now. The Conservative members of the committee put forward a proposal to do exactly that. I don't think that we should be waiting. I think that we need to do it now. And then in the absence of that apparent legislation, which is going to be coming down sometime, in the absence of that being presented to us, I think that we need to vote against this private member's bill, and that is what I will be doing. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
L'honorable député de Rivière-du...
The honourable member for Rivière-du-Nord.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Présidente, sans surprise.
It's no surprise the Bloc is skeptical about this bill. I said previously at second reading that we wanted it sent to committee so that it could be improved upon. And I would say that I moved an amendment that was rejected, and it would have made it possible to use necessary and reasonable force for the safety of the child by a third party or for the child's education. That was rejected. So today I find myself required to say that it's quite difficult for me to support this bill. Other people appeared before committee and said, don't do this. It's a mistake. It's very risky. And my colleague just said, and I agree fully with him, I would also quote from Professor Sébastien Joly from the Provincial Association of Quebec Teachers, who said that the association is convinced that repealing this provision would make no sense, and it would create a serious risk for the safety of teachers and school staff. As I said, that was the Provincial Teachers Association, but there was another witness, president of the Canadian Federation of Teachers, who said to us that the Federation cannot support the passage of this bill unreservedly. The risk of unforeseen consequences could make the task more dangerous, and the risk is too great. Teachers need to be able to intervene physically in some situations in the classroom. That's the reality. And the situation in classrooms is complex. Students' needs are complex. So if two kids are fighting in a classroom, you can't just say, that's not nice. Could you please stop? Could you please sit down? No, the fight, an end has to be put to the fight before someone's injured. And the teacher, which has the parental authority, has to intervene and separate the belligerents and sit them down, ask one to leave the class, for example. There are all kinds of situations. But I have too much respect for teachers to think that I know what's best for them. But those teachers who appeared before the committee said, you can't tell us that we're going to be liable to criminal prosecution if we touch a student. This case has been before the courts a number of times, as you've heard previously, in the Bender case in 2023. It wasn't even a year ago, the Bender case. A teacher was accused of assault after redirecting a child outside the classroom, and the court acquitted the teacher fully, saying that it was absolutely reasonable under the meaning of the provision of the Criminal Code. And the Court Supreme, with all due respect for my NDP colleague's opinion, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. And when the Supreme Court speaks, the other courts must listen and they must toe the line. So I'm not saying it's not important. You can't be dismissive of a Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court said that without this provision in the Criminal Code, it could criminalize the use of force when it disagrees with when it's not consistent with the parents' notions of physical control. So the decision not to criminalize such conduct is based not on devaluing the child, but on the notion that criminalizing that conduct would place an unfair burden, and it would take away any advantage that might flow from criminal prosecution. So that's in Canadian Foundation for Children in that decision. So yes, it's a 20-year-old decision. It was in 2004, but it was the Supreme Court who said that. And until they rule otherwise, that has force of law. So that is still currently the law of the land. So Section 43 is justifiable despite what anyone might have to say about it. Once again, I had moved an amendment because I'm trying to find compromise, Madam Speaker. I think there's some good things in this bill. I don't want a child to be the subject of corporal punishment, and all courts ruling on this provision of the Criminal Code say that taking an object to hit a child or hitting them on the head or hitting a child under the age of 2 who doesn't understand what's going on is pointless. And that does not enjoy the protection of Section 43. So we moved an amendment, as I said at the outset, which was dismissed. But my amendment, Madam Speaker, was, how shall I put it, kind of like a fallback position, a compromise. But there was something else before that. There was a Conservative amendment that was rejected, but also the Liberal member, I can't remember the name of his riding, but he said at committee on April 29th, I share your opinion, Mr. Fortin, because we heard compelling evidence from many groups of teachers in Quebec and all across Canada. People raised very legitimate concerns, and we need to take those into consideration. However, I don't think it's appropriate to raise this issue in the context of Section 43. And then he said, following discussion with colleagues on this side of the table, and with Minister Virani, who was the Minister of Justice, he assured us that he would present a separate bill at some point on a separate provision of the Criminal Code in order to meet the concerns raised by teachers that would be in keeping with the positions raised by all the witnesses who appeared here. So it's a long quote. I'm sorry for that, Madam Speaker, but suffice it to say, it's not just teachers, and it's not just members here, and it's not just parents. Everyone, even government members, are concerned about the scope that might result from repealing Section 43 without replacing it by another solution, which would enable parents and others in a parental situation of authority not to use force to beat a child, but to use force to educate a child, to avoid them injuring themselves or injuring another child. It seems to me that that's so reasonable that I'm scratching my head. Are we not just wasting our time discussing this? It seems so obvious, but I think it's obvious anyways. It was obvious to most of the witnesses we heard from, and it should be for us too. It should be clear. And Madam Speaker, my colleague said that there are other countries that have passed similar legislation, but in each case, or almost every case that I looked into, it was corporal punishment that was banned, Madam Speaker. Well, you know what, Madam Speaker? I agree. Beating a child for the sake of beating them because you're angry, for example, there's no place for that. And in Japan in 2020, they passed legislation. They said that a person exercising parental authority towards a child should not discipline them using corporal punishment or by doing anything beyond what is strictly necessary for the care and education of the child. So that's the point, Madam Speaker, almost everywhere in the world, and it's common sense. Corporal punishment is not what this is about. Perhaps it was commonplace 50 years ago, 100 years ago, to take a ruler and hit a child or spank them. But today, that's no longer happening. Society has evolved, and we now understand that that's not any way to raise a child in this day and age. But preventing a teacher from using reasonable force in a school setting in order to control what's going on in schoolrooms and parks, that goes too far. And it puts people at risk, because there will be situations where there will be fights among children, and the teachers will just have to cross their arms and say, well, I hope this doesn't end too badly. I don't want that. If my children are fighting in a schoolyard or in a classroom, and if there's a battle, I really don't mind the idea that the teacher steps in and makes everyone sit down, separates them, and says, okay, we're going to talk this out. I think we need to be very careful before we do what this bill would do. And unless there's an amendment, unless there's a proposal to replace Section 43 of the Criminal Code, like the Liberal member suggested, well, unless that happens, we're unfortunately going to have to vote against this bill, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start with a quote by James Baldwin, and it's always stuck with me. He said, "The children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe." And I'm beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality. Mr. Speaker, today we're here to act on behalf of the countless advocates, the families, and most importantly, the children who deserve a future that is free from violence and fear. Bill C-273 will repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code, and this is the section that makes physical punishment of children legal in Canada. And as a mother of 2 young children, it's hard for me to even think about my girls being hit by someone 5 times their size. To think that in Canada, parents can legally hit children as young as my sweet 3-year-old. We stand today on the precipice of passing this bill, of creating transformative change. And I urge my colleagues in this House to reflect on the urgency and the moral clarity that this bill represents. Section 43 of the Criminal Code allows the use of reasonable force to correct children. It is an archaic provision that has long outlived its place in a compassionate society. And it's not only that this provision perpetuates violence, but it also undermines our efforts for true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And I want to thank the member from New Westminster Burnaby for putting forward this bill. And he noted in his speech that repealing this section is a critical step in fulfilling call to action number 6 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And we must move forward and implement this bill, but also all of the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation report. Now, corporal punishment of children, it is a violation of their human rights, a fundamental truth that is recognized by the United Nations and echoed in the global research. More than 65 countries, including Germany, Sweden, South Africa, have already banned this practice. And these countries have seen profound improvements in child welfare, in reductions in aggressive behavior, in the long-term positive impacts on our societies as a whole. And the research consistently shows that corporal punishment leads to increased aggression, increased mental health challenges, and a perpetuation of violence that often stretches across generations. I want to take a moment to respond to some of the comments that I've heard from colleagues in the Conservative and Bloc caucus. This is not something that happened in the past and no longer exists. Children are still being hit today. Yeah. Corrective punishment of being pushed down, slapped. And to think that we would accept that